question. Mr Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I beg leave to ask the Prime Minister if he will make a statement about the instructions issued by the Cabinet Secretary to permanent secretaries in respect of EU referendum guidance for the civil service and special advisers.
The Minister for the Cabinet Office, Minister Matt Hancock.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The referendum on the 23rd of June on the European Union represents the biggest constitutional decision for the nation in a generation, and the government position is clear. Britain will be stronger, safer and better off by remaining in a reformed European Union. Today's government document setting out the process of leaving underlines that case, showing that a vote to leave could lead to up to a decade or more of damaging uncertainty with real consequences for putting jobs and investment at risk, and I concur with that assessment. Because of the significance of the referendum, as the House knows, the Prime Minister took the decision to allow collective responsibility to be suspended on the referendum question. This approach was discussed and agreed by Cabinet on the 20th of February. The process is clear. Ministers may depart from the government position in a personal capacity on the specific question of the referendum. On all other matters, including on other EU business, government operates as normal, and in all things, the civil servants support the government position. Guidance on how this will work in practice was set out and published by the Cabinet Secretary last week. The guidance is clear. Other than on the specific question of the referendum, all ministers can commission and see all documents as normal. On the question of the referendum, and on this question alone, ministers who disagree with the government position naturally cannot commission policy work on the in-out question or see documents setting out details of the case to remain. All ministers can ask for factual briefing and for facts to be checked in any matter. All ministers can see documents on EU issues not related to the referendum question as normal. So the guidance is clear, it's published, and the process was agreed at Cabinet as the best way to manage the unusual situation of ministers who disagree with a government remaining in post. I hope this clarity will allow members on all sides of the House now to focus on the main debate, on whether Britain will be better served by leaving or remaining in a reformed European Union, and then let the people decide.
Mr Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And clarity on this issue is one thing that we do not have. Mr Speaker, nobody objects to the government making its case in this referendum, but most people expect the civil service to be impartial in carrying out its support for ministers. It is established in law that ministers are accountable for their departments, and voters expect government facts and figures to be impartial and accurate, whether they are used by ministers who support remain or leave. So why does the Cabinet Secretary's letter go far beyond the limits actually placed on dissenting ministers during the 1975 referendum? The then Industry Secretary Peter Shaw's Permanent Secretary, Sir Peter Thornton, was quoted as saying, and I quote, "It was jolly difficult putting forward anti-common market briefs to Mr Shaw, but I hope we did what he asked." What a different atmosphere from today. But worse than this, there has been a Q&A briefing circulated following the letter which states that ministers may not see any papers, and I quote, "that have a bearing on the referendum question or are intended to be used in support of their position of the referendum." This has been described by one minister, my right honourable friend for Whittam, as unconstitutional. How can such a wide ban be justified? How does my right honourable friend reconcile this with his comment on Radio 4 this morning, and I quote, "The government is functioning in all questions other than specifically the in-out question in an entirely normal way," and he said, "and there's no other rules other than those set out last Monday in the letter from Jeremy Heywood." Well, what about the Q&A briefing? And does the Minister deny that permanent secretaries have been instructed to conceal information requested by Downing Street or by the Cabinet Office from a dissenting minister? The Cabinet Secretary's letter states, and I quote, "Departments may check facts, but civil servants have also been told they cannot, quote, provide arguments or new facts," unquote. How is this consistent with the Civil Service Code duty of honesty, which requires a civil servant to, and I quote, "set out the facts and relevant issues truthfully," unquote? Does the Minister agree that where any guidance or instruction conflicts with the code must prevail? And how does this situation best serve the democratic process if ministers on opposing sides of the debate finish up disagreeing about information from the same government department and which is meant to be impartial and accurate information provided by professional civil servants?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'll answer the points in turn. The first question is on the functioning of government. Of course the government is functioning perfectly well. In fact, I've come to this House from a meeting with the Right Honourable Member for Whittam about childcare policy, which was carried out in entirely the normal way. And in fact, on Friday, I was visiting a prison with the Justice Secretary, and I think those 2 points demonstrate that things are functioning as normal. On the question of the Civil Service Code, the Civil Service Code, and indeed in law in the Constitutional Affairs Act of 2010, makes it clear that it is the duty of civil servants to support the position of the government of the day. And it is only because the Prime Minister is allowing ministers to remain in government whilst disagreeing with a single policy, which is the in-out position, that this situation arises at all. And the letter from the Cabinet Secretary makes clear that factual briefing is allowed. And finally, I'd just like to come to this point about the 1975 guidance, because that 1975 guidance itself made clear that no briefing or draft speeches, contrary to the government consideration, were allowed to be drafted by civil servants. In fact, it went further, because it said that if you wanted to oppose the government position, you had to inform Number 10 of any invitations to appear on radio or TV, and we haven't put that one in place. So I think on all of these things, the clarity around publishing the guidance that comes from the Cabinet Secretary, which was published on Monday of last week, shows the rules. They are consistent with the Civil Service Code and indeed the law.
Tom Watson.
Mr. Speaker, I fear the Minister is having a Jim Hacker moment. In 114 days' time, the country faces an important decision. The referendum will dictate how, in the future, the UK handles exports and imports, the world of work, the new contours of the digital age, human rights, intelligence sharing, the fight against crime, and how we adapt to climate change. And here we are all today discussing the guidelines to civil servants and special advisers. Mr. Speaker, sadly, I am not in the strongest of positions to lecture the poor Minister on handling splits in his own party. But in the way that opposition frontbenchers are almost duty-bound to do so, I would like to give him some advice. The Justice Secretary has a history of letting his special advisers off the leash. Does the Minister really think that a memorandum from a Mandarin is going to change that situation? And when we have a Prime Minister allowing his own spin doctors to brief that the Justice Secretary will be sacked after the referendum, or that his chum, the Mayor of London, has breached the old school code and that the Prime Minister is hurt and upset, I can understand how the Minister would have been overcome with a wave of ennui at the prospect of answering an urgent question from the Chair of the Public Administration Committee about the conduct of special advisers. Yet, Mr. Speaker, answer for their conduct he must. So I would like to ask him, how many special advisers have informed Number 10 of their intention to work on the No campaign? In the event of ministerial visits where a minister and their special adviser go on a campaign for a no vote after the event, will the cost of travel be carried by the Minister? How will this be monitored and made public? The guidelines state that special advisers are not allowed to campaign for a no vote in office hours. For the avoidance of doubt, please define office hours. When the inevitable happens, when the special adviser to the ministers who are defying their leader completely ignore the memorandum from the Cabinet Secretary, on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident is he that the Prime Minister will enforce the code? And does the Minister have confidence to admit that these attempts to dilute the freedom of rebellious ministers will only detract from the key issues that matter to voters in the referendum? Mr. Speaker, it seems to me that the Out campaign are attacking a referee, not the captain of the opposing side. Yet the Prime Minister does have a simple choice. Either he gives his ministers free rein to run their departments, or he sacks them. It cannot be fudged for the next 114 days.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, I had to scrap most of my proposed reply to the honourable member, given his gracious acknowledgement that he wasn't best placed to throw rocks on this particular subject. But I will agree with him on this, which is that questions over this are a distraction from the main event and the main substance, which is the question of whether Britain is better off inside or outside a reformed European Union. And I strongly believe that, thanks to the deal that the Prime Minister achieved, we are better off and more secure inside a reformed European Union. On some of the specific questions, firstly about the efficacy of the guidance is for civil servants to follow, and civil servants do follow guidance of that sort, and I have every confidence that they will. On the question of what constitutes office hours, I will merely say that office hours mean the normal working day, and I hope that clears that one up. And on the broader question of whether this is is necessary, and his point that that ministers need to both run their departments and are able to differ on this one question. That's why this guidance is very specifically, solely about the in-out question, not about other EU business or other business, because after all, we have departments to run.
Michael Fabricant.
My right honourable friend is hugely able, and he's shown his ability today to dance on the head of a pin. But will he take it from me, this is a huge blunder, because out there the general public will think that this decision has been petty and has been vindictive. And moreover, they will say to our government and this party of which I'm so proud to belong, if we're so much stronger in Europe, what is it? What is it that we're so careful to hide?
Well, I have a huge amount of respect for my honourable friend, and I would just say this. The reason that this is required is because of the decision of the Prime Minister to allow ministers to campaign to leave and to differ from the government position. If that weren't the case, then this guidance wouldn't be needed at all. And on the point of whether of what the general public take away from this, I imagine what most people would take away from this is, can we get on to the real discussion, which is about whether we should be in or out of a reformed European Union?
Tommy Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me see if I've got this right. The government's position is that we should vote to remain in the European Union for, amongst other reasons, that it would be good for jobs and employment. The government's problem is that the Secretary of State and the Minister responsible for jobs and employment take a contrary view. And the government is now in a dilemma where it doesn't want its own ministers not just to not support the government's position, but to actively campaign against it by using their offices to do so. And in response to this, the government is now putting the obligation on unelected civil servants to censor what ministers can or cannot see within their area of expertise. Mr. Speaker, this situation is farcical, but it also has an undercurrent of something sinister about it as well. I would say that any self-respecting minister should not accept these constraints. And my question to the Minister for the Cabinet Office is simply this. Your party has already got a bit of tension on this question. How long do you think it will be before you break into all-out civil war?
Well, the honourable member makes an absolutely central error in the characterisation of the situation, which is that no minister is censored. Far from it. Ministers are allowed to campaign against the government position, and it is for civil servants, therefore, to follow the government position. And after all, it is required by law that they follow and support the position of the government of the day.
Dr. Liam Fox.
Mr. Speaker, but there is a serious constitutional issue here which goes to the heart of House of Commons accountability. We ask ministers questions and expect answers that are fully informed. Now, how can those who send us to this House of Commons have faith in the answers we get if those that we are questioning purposely have information withheld by their own civil servants?
I have a huge amount of respect for the right honourable gentleman, and that's why I'll come to this specific point and answer it specifically. That is the question that he asks is exactly the reason for prescribing this guidance to only being about the in-out issue rather than more broadly. That is what the guidance says. And this approach, this broad approach, was set up by the Prime Minister in January. It was then discussed and agreed at Cabinet on the 20th of February as the best way to take forward this position in which ministers could disagree with the government position.
Very decent of the Minister to dole out bowls full of respect, but my sense is that on the whole, although that's obviously enormously important to honourable and right honourable members here assembled, they're generally on the whole, I think, more interested in his answers than in his respect. And Mr. Tom Brady.
Mr. Speaker, I'd previously asked if the Prime Minister was going to throw his weight behind the in campaign. I'm very pleased that he has done so, because I think for the sake of our peace, prosperity, opportunity and security, we need to be in. But just in relation to what we're discussing now, I'd like to seek clarity from the Minister. Is it the case that there is a list of ministers who are in, a list of ministers who are out, a list of ministers who are undecided, and what happens if a minister switches from the in to the out campaign or the out to the in campaign?
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, I have respect for the honourable gentleman, and I almost also have respect for you. Maybe I'll drop all that. But on the point that the honourable gentleman raises, when Cabinet met after the Prime Minister agreed the deal with the other members of the European Union, ministers at that point were asked to state their position, whether they were going to remain or leave, and I doubt that any of those positions will change.
Veritably, my cup runneth over at the generosity and good grace of the Minister, to whom we're all indebted. Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister calls on the law. The question of voter trust in this referendum, as I said to both the Prime Minister and to the Foreign Secretary on the 3rd and the 25th of February, is paramount, and, Mr. Speaker, for the voters who will decide this question. Knowledge, as we know, is power. Does the Minister deny that under Sections 6 and 7 of the later and express provisions of the European Referendum Act, which itself imposes a legal duty on the government to provide referendum information, that the voter is entitled to accurate and impartial information, as the Minister for Europe agreed in reply to me in the House on that bill, through and from the government and all ministers of the Crown equally, and that this, therefore, being a statutory obligation, overrides any prime ministerial prerogative, such as the Cabinet Secretary has acted upon his guidance of 23rd February? And does the Minister therefore deny that civil servants, as Crown servants, are legally obliged to provide such information accurately and impartially to all ministers within their departments, so that the voters are properly informed and are empowered to answer the question in the referendum?
On the legal details, the Act also requires for the government to express its view, and the Constitutional Affairs Act 2010 requires civil servants to support the position of the government of the day, and it's on that basis that it is right to follow the procedure that we have agreed by Cabinet, such that the position of the government is set out. Ministers may disagree with it, but civil servants support the government's position.
Mr. Dennis Skinner.
Here we are, the day after the Oscars. The family is opposite. Threats and counter-threats. It reminds me of Godfather. This could be Godfather 4. Will there be a horse's head in the bed, or will it be another animal?
Well, they say that politics is show business for ugly people, so I'll take that as an upgrade.
Mr. Crispin Blunt.
I find it hard to believe that the Cabinet on the 20th of February knew the implications of what it was actually doing. The Elections, Political Parties and Referendum Act, the central purpose of that is to achieve fairness in elections and in referenda. And now the government has parked itself on one side of the argument, dwarfing any influence of either of the campaign groups. And it also goes against the strategic objective of offering the people a referendum to actually resolve this question about Britain's role in the world one way or the other. And that question will only hold if this is seen to be fair. And all of this runs against that strategic objective.
Well, I disagree with my honourable friend, and the reason is this: the government is required under the Referendum Act to take a position, and it's also required, or the commitments were given during the passage of that Act, to set out certain things. For instance, to set out the process of leaving the EU, which we published this morning under Article 50. So the debate was had during the passage of that Act as to how this was best done, and these were the conclusions of it, which we're following through.
Paul Flynn.
Isn't this constitutional gibberish and utterly unworkable? The protestations from the government benches now would be much more impressive had they joined the Select Committee when we condemned the politicisation of the civil service during the Scottish referendum. But the difference is, during the Scottish referendum, all ministers agreed. Here we got a disagreement, and we'll have departments where the inners can see the papers and the outers can't see the papers. Isn't the only way to make this workable is for the ministers to resign, to leave office until after June the 23rd?
Well, it's precisely because we didn't want that to happen that we've come up with, proposed these arrangements. And I would say to him, on this, the point about civil servants, I think he is wholly wrong and misjudging the position if he thinks that civil servants supporting the government's position is anything other than the impartial and proper position for them to be. If the alternative view is to argue that civil servants should not support the government's position, and I think that would be ridiculous.
Mr. Rowan Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On a daily basis, DEFRA ministers have to make a difficult decision between interpretation of European law and regulation and delivering a decision which would benefit UK citizens. I have a whole number of cases in the past which I would like to discuss with my honourable friend, the member for Camborne and Redruth, the current Minister of State. I have a meeting with him this evening. Can I ask him questions on past cases where he can go back without any fear or favour and have full briefing, all the opinions, all the history, before and after that decision, although the end result might be thoroughly disobliging to the case for remaining in the European Union?
My right honourable friend makes a very important point. On EU issues that are not issues of the single question of in or out, then full access to all papers as normal will happen. That's what it says in the letter from the Cabinet Secretary, and that's how government is operating.
Mr Kelvin Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. During the referendum on Scottish independence to which my honourable friend has just referred, there was significant controversy over senior civil servants making public and clearly political and politicised statements. It is vital that the civil service retains its private advisory role and that civil servants do not make blatantly political public comments during the campaign before the EU referendum. Will the Minister confirm that this will be the case?
Well, that is the normal course of events, because it's for ministers to make the argument and for the civil servants to support the government's position.
Mr David Davis.
Not standing.
See, order! Can I order? Can I just say, Right Honourable Johnson is a most dexterous parliamentarian, so I'm sure he can recover very quickly. I think the accurate characterisation would be that he had been standing. He did not do so on that occasion, probably because he was chuntering from a sedentary position. He then stood again at my exhortation. He's now had plenty of time to formulate his question. Mr David Davis.
It's all right, Mr Speaker. I was not sure whether it was the other David Davis you were calling, but there we are. We are fortunate. We are fortunate to live in a democracy. We're fortunate to live in a democracy. We are not guided by Cabinet Secretary guidelines. As far as I'm aware, there's no manifesto basis for this. As far as I'm aware, there's no House of Commons vote for this. So what is the constitutional basis of the Prime Minister's decision here? Is it royal prerogative?
No, the constitutional basis is that in the EU Referendum Act, the government is required to take a position. The government has a position, as I've set out, and it's for civil servants to support that position. How civil servants therefore act with a minister who does not support the government position is necessary to set out. It is precisely limited to the in-out question, and the reason for publishing it is to make sure that everybody knows what the position is.
Margaret Ferrier.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Sir Nicholas Macpherson, the Treasury's most senior civil servant, was quoted in saying that he believed impartiality guidelines do not apply in extreme cases like that of the Scottish independence referendum. I wonder if the Minister would classify the EU referendum as an extreme case, and if so, can we expect normal rules of civil service neutrality to be completely disregarded?
Civil servants support the government position of the day, and the government has a position. I don't know how many times I'm going to have to repeat that, but that is the case. Civil servants are impartial, but they support the government of the day. That is the law, and it is the situation in this case too.
Neil Carmichael.
Does the Paymaster General agree with me that it would be supremely ironic if this referendum had an impact on the way our civil service actually operates in the future? Because, of course, it's absolutely right that it does support the government, and the government has made a decision, in my view the right decision, that we are safer, stronger and better in the European Union.
Well, it is disappointing that the Leave campaign seems to want to focus on process issues like this rather than discussing whether we'd be better off inside a reformed European Union, which I think they would. But the point that he raises is an important one, and the point is this. If you don't think that the rules should operate as was published last week, then the only other position is that the civil service should support a position which is not the government's position, and that goes against everything that they were set up to do.
John Cryer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Isn't this the Prime Minister effectively saying to his own ministers, you can exercise your democratic rights as long, at the end of the day, as you agree with me? And isn't it the latest sordid attempt, and there will be more in the future, to rig the referendum to get the result the Prime Minister wants?
No, on the contrary, it's the consequences of having ministers who are allowed to speak their view and to express their view freely, as many of them are doing, whether they want to remain in or out.
Nick Herbert.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Would the Minister agree with me that the misunderstanding of the government's position is evidenced by the last question, which suggested that the Prime Minister is requiring ministers to agree with him? He is not. Is not the whole point, and will the public not see it in this way, that the question of fairness is ensured by the fact that ministers are free to speak out. That is what the Prime Minister is allowing. That is, in fact, a generous position. There is no reason why they should be supported by the civil service or the taxpayer in expressing their view, to which they are entitled in conscience. And, of course, if they did feel that this was unfair, they always had the option of not remaining in the government.
Yes.
Mr. Andrew Slaughter.
Mr. Speaker, the Lord Chancellor has an important constitutional job, but he just can't do it under these restrictions. At the weekend, we heard that the so-called British Bill of Rights is going to be postponed again for at least 6 months. If the Lord Chancellor wants his lawyers or civil servants to put together well-crafted arguments on parliamentary sovereignty or the powers of the European Court of Justice, shouldn't they be allowed to do that? Otherwise, we're getting second-class government, and God forbid we had that.
Of course, the Lord Chancellor can continue to do the work that he's doing in reforming the court system in all sorts of areas. Indeed, I was with him visiting a prison on Friday, as I mentioned. And that shows that government is getting on with its work and then having, on top of that, a debate. There's a debate in the country, and ministers on both sides, about the specific question of an in-out referendum.
Mr. Richard Fuller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When people in Bedford and Kempston raised the issue of the European referendum with me, over the past week, the thing they wanted, Mr. Speaker, is they wanted facts. They know they get lots of statistics, but they fear that they are warped from one side or the other, so they want facts. Can my honourable friend advise me how this restriction on access to information will enable them to have facts?
It will not have any implications for facts, because factual briefing and fact-checking is allowed to be proposed to be done by civil servants.
Sir Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker, the civil service, the state broadcaster and the central bank were all central players in Project 301 in Scotland. Is it therefore not naive not to expect the use of the same public assets when it comes to Project 302 and the EU referendum?
I don't understand the premise of the question, because we're putting forward the positive case for remaining in a reformed European Union.
Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Minister set out what would be the harm in allowing full transparency of this data? Surely there would be a much greater harm if we were left at the end of the referendum with people feeling that it had been an unfair process.
The challenge of taking a position other than the one that the government has taken is that it would require civil servants to do work that was not in support of the position of the government. And the government has a position, and it is part of the Civil Service Code. It's put into law in the 2010 Constitutional Affairs Act that civil servants should support the position of the government, and it would put them in a very difficult position if we were to do anything other than that.
Mr. Andrew Gwynn.
I will be campaigning for Britain to remain in the European Union, but having said that, I see really no issue with all ministers in government having access to the very arguments which I believe are strong arguments for Britain to remain in the European Union. I do think it's a matter of democracy. So is the Minister really suggesting that we could have a situation where a Secretary of State is denied access to key government papers, but his or her junior ministers have access to that information?
What we're saying is that the government has a position, and the civil service will advise on that position. And if ministers have taken a personal decision to campaign personally, in a personal capacity, against the position of the government, then it is inappropriate to our civil servants to support that position, which is not the position of the government.
Dr. Andrew Murus.
I'd very much appreciate that the Minister has qualified and caveated some of the guidance that has recently been issued. But does he not agree with me that there is a danger that without further clarification we could have the ludicrous situation where Freedom of Information Act requests or requests by members of Parliament through parliamentary questions could get information out of ministers that those ministers themselves would have been denied by their own civil servants?
I don't know whether that was directed at the shadow front bench, but the situation is, as I've set out, But the key point is this. If we were to take any other position, then we would have civil servants not able to, being asked not to support the position of the government. This has been the way that these things have been approached in referendums in the past, in 75, and also in the Scottish referendum, which seems perfectly reasonable.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Because this is such a divisive issue, and because so many people feel so strongly about it, it's been decided that instead of government taking the decision, the people should take the decision. What does it do for the sense of fairness among the people if the big battalions of the civil service seem to be lined up on one side of the argument and spin doctors in Downing Street do botched letters to the press from generals who hadn't even signed up to them, saying that one side of the argument is right and the other side of the argument is wrong?
Well, the debate over how this would operate took place during the passage of the European Referendum Bill, which my right honourable friend, the Europe Minister, took through. In the passage of that bill, there was quite a debate about, for instance, how PERDA should operate, and many concessions were made by the government in order to ensure that the process is fair, and the result of that was a referendum act which included the requirement for the government to take a view and then to be able to set out information on various aspects of the referendum, and that is exactly what we're doing.
Sir Gerald Howarth.
Mr. Speaker, I think I heard the ministers say that dissenting ministers are not going to be allowed to see papers making the case for Britain to remain in the EU, which suggests that the government has very little confidence in its own arguments. But can I put it to my right honourable friend that it is a constitutional outrage to deny access to arguments that may, as the briefing paper says, may have a bearing on the referendum, to some key ministers in the DWP and in the Justice Department who are intimately involved in the central issues to this referendum. And the government really needs to think again about this, because otherwise I think the British people will think the government is intending to rig the referendum.
The constitutional difficulty would arise if civil servants were being asked to support a position that was not the position of the government. The civil service is there to support the government, and so I would argue to the contrary that this is precisely in order to stick to the Constitution as set out by the Constitutional Affairs Act, but as carried out in practice for decades and decades before that, that the job of the civil service is to support the government, and that is what they should do.
Mrs Anne Main.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think the British public could be forgiven for thinking that if someone like the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green is not permitted to see all the relevant documents, that he then maybe cannot advise the government, and the government has come to a fixed opinion on a particular view such as benefits without having all the facts. And I would reiterate, the Cabinet Office sent round, can dissenting ministers see department papers on matters that aren't directly about the referendum but may have a bearing? And the answers are, they can see or commission any papers produced by the departments in the normal way, except those that have a bearing on the referendum question or are intended to be used in support of their position. So it isn't a simple black and white matter. It's a matter of interpretation where the special advisers are being handcuffed and being told that they must keep things from the Secretary of State. That is an appalling thing. Are they afraid that the public, and indeed the facts, might change the minds of some of the honourable members that are in Cabinet?
I think when it comes to what the public think, which is what my honourable friend was focused on, is they will think, can we please get on to debating the substance of the question rather than the process of how you make sure that ministers are allowed, unusually, to depart from the government position, and yet the constitutional position of the civil service remain in place.
Mr David Jones.
Is it true, as reported in this morning's Times, that without the consent or knowledge of the Secretary of State, officials of the Department of Work and Pensions carried out research on the instructions of Number 10 to help support the case for remaining in the EU? And if that is indeed the case,
Can the Minister please explain how the Secretary of State can be expected to be responsible for the work of his own department?
Well, these guidelines are restricted to the issues of the question of in-out. But it's perfectly normal and happens all the time that there's communications between departments and Number 10. That's how government operates.
Mr. Timothy Lawton.
Mr. Speaker, perhaps the solution is for ministers to submit FOI requests to their own departments to get the answers. A key part of the Prime Minister's reform package was very complex changes to benefits and indexing of benefits. So at the next question time for the DWP, if I ask the Secretary of State what progress he is making to determining whether those reforms are actually deliverable or not by June the 23rd, will he be able to give me an honest and full answer?
Yes, of course, because on issues that are not about the in-out referendum question, then ministers will be fully informed. So that is the position. And as to the question of whether this will change people's minds, the government has made its position clear, which is that we're obviously in favour of Remain.
Sir Edward Lee.
At the moment, I'm the Fisheries Minister. Young, ambitious, good-looking, all those things. Anxious to do the Prime Minister's bidding. And the Prime Minister tells me that I've got to set out my vision of what life outside the EU means for fishing. And indeed, this is a huge question for our fishing fleets. What do I do? Because the EU determines everything in my department. I have no national policy in fishing, but I happen to be in favour of the out campaign. Do I go home for 4 months? Do I get no advice from ministers? Is it not so much, yes, Minister, but just go home for 4 months and we'll see you in June?
The honourable member, my honourable friend, makes an incredibly important point, which is that the rules set out last week make clear that in all issues, including EU issues, other than the in-out question, government continues as normal. So I'm afraid he can't have 4 months off, even in that circumstance, and I'm sure that he wouldn't want to miss the next 4 months for the world.
Mr. Philip Hollowbone.
The Paymaster General is a minister in the Cabinet Office, which is the government department responsible for the civil service. Yet my right honourable friend has form when it comes to civil service advice, because in June 2015 he signed a special declaration overriding civil service advice that further money should not be given to Kids Company, which subsequently disappeared. Would it be open to ministers of the Crown to use that same special declaration to override this present civil service edict?
The question of making what's called a direction, which I made on Kids Company, because I thought that it was worth spending the money to look after the kids in that company, and it's right that ministers should be able to democratically override advice of civil servants when they choose to, and as long as that is published. That is about expenditure of money. This EU debate and the issues in it, although, of course, there's debates about, the growth and jobs and the economy, is not specifically about the expenditure of money, and so the question wouldn't arise.
Mr. Bob Stewart.
Mr. Speaker. Several constituents of mine have contacted me, Mr. Speaker, and asked where they can get the facts in order to decide in their own mind how to vote. Now, it is, after all, the people, not the government, that are going to decide this matter. And therefore, under those circumstances, is it not the duty of the civil service to provide facts to our people to enable them to decide what they should vote? And under those circumstances, again, is it not fair to ask the Cabinet Secretary to prepare a document for the people who will make this decision in his capacity as a neutral observer?
Well, absolutely it's necessary to ensure that information is available on questions around this referendum, That is, for instance, why we've published this morning a document on the process for leaving the European Union, should that be the decision at the referendum. But he's right, it is for the people to decide. The Cabinet Secretary is not neutral. He supports the government position because he's a civil servant, and the whole civil service supports the government position. And when it comes to information, if he's responding to his constituents, then if they really want information, I can always recommend a website called Stronger In, which has got some great information about it, and there's going to be, at some point, a campaign and there's going to be a campaign to leave as well. And I hope that this debate continues so that everybody, by the 23rd of June, feels fully informed.
Mr. Andrew Bridgen.
Could the Minister tell the House how the guidance rules would have affected the advice given to the Prime Minister by Sir Linton Crosby when he said that the renegotiations were not good enough, they should be rejected at the European Council, proper renegotiations carried out, and the referendum delayed till 2017? Because clearly in that situation, the adviser wasn't supporting the government line at all.
Sir Linton Crosby is many things, but one of the things that he is not is a civil servant.
Mr. Stuart Jacks.
Would a reasonable and fair-minded person not conclude that, having been rebuffed in its attempts last September to alter on a sui generis basis the PERDA rules relating to the referendum, that this government has come back and undermined the sovereignty of this House by using the civil service to achieve the very same objective?
No, on the contrary. On the contrary. This guidance is a precise consequence of the Prime Minister's decision to allow ministers to campaign to leave. If the Prime Minister had not decided to allow ministers to remain in the government but campaign to leave the European Union against the recommendation of the government, then rules like this would not be necessary and we wouldn't have had to publish them. This is a direct consequence of the Prime Minister's decision to allow that debate to take place and allow ministers to take one or other side of the debate.
Mr. Andrew Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Talking of guidance, my association this morning was issued with guidance from our North of England field director stating the party is neutral, which means that as an organisation we are not getting involved in any way on an official basis. This means that associations must not use any resources available to them, including money, data, premises, etc., to promote a particular view. Now, given this is a Conservative government made up of Conservative ministers from the top down, from the Prime Minister all the way down to us lowly backbenchers, who are all members of a party which has no official view on this, why should, given that civil servants work for ministers of the Conservative Party, why should they be taking a view on this? It's leading people out there to conclude that there is a stitch-up to try and keep us in the wasteful EU.
I don't think that's right. This House passed the EU referendum bill, which required the government to take a view, and therefore the civil service followed the government view. The Conservative Party is, as he says, is neutral on this matter, but the government is not. And that is a matter for how the party machine acts rather than how the government acts, because, as I've said many times, the civil service is duty-bound by tradition and by law to follow the position of the government of the day, and that is why this guidance is constructed thus.
There are points of order. Point of order, Mr. Bernard Jenkins.
Mr. Speaker, during the exchanges we've just had, it was noted that the Minister did not refer to the question and answer brief that's been circulated by the Cabinet Office to civil servants, which carries some of the wider interpretation of the letter. And I wonder how I can draw the House's attention to the fact that we will be publishing this on the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee website later today or tomorrow, Mr. Speaker.
As I think the honourable gentleman knows, and I say in response to his spurious point of order, he has achieved his objective. He should consider the matter so advertised. I'm not sure there is a further to that point of order, but I'll hear it first and then come to a view about it. further point of order, Anne Main.
Well, I read out the self-same question and answer, and indeed it says may have a bearing. At what point, Mr. Speaker, can we have some sort of qualification of what may have a bearing on actually means? Who will be arbitrating on that particular discussion?
Well, that's really a matter for the government. Now, legendarily, the minister from whom we've just heard is always keen to address the House. Indeed, he has in the past likened himself to Disraeli, who had a notable enthusiasm for addressing the House. Now, if the minister wishes to respond to the honourable lady with that legendary succinctness for which he's renowned, we're happy to hear from him, but he's not under any obligation to do so. On a point of order.
Minister Hancock. I think I answered that point, because the question is, how do we make sure that the guidance means that civil servants follow the government position, including on the in-out question, which is the only question from which ministers can move from the government position. And so it's a question of whether something is an in-out question or is normal EU business. I think I set that out earlier. I might have said the same.
Extremely grateful to the minister. I'm not sure from the head movements of the honourable member for St Albans that he has satisfied her, but I'm not sure that he would have been able, or any minister would have been able to do so.